My name's Marc Furmie and I'm a writer-director. My background was, I knew from a very early age I wanted to direct, so it was just working out the best and most efficient path to getting there. And for me it was, after high school going to study fine arts with a major in film at COFA. And from there, basically making a lot of short films and a lot of independent music videos for upcoming artists. And that led into funding from Screen Australia to make a short film, Death's Requiem, in 2006. And then from there, subsequent short films and dozens of commercials have just escalated and helped me build a pretty solid portfolio to the point now where I'm able to have just made my first feature film, Terminus. Back in 2009, I had an idea for a science fiction film, which it was essentially it was almost a sci-fi reimagining of the story of Noah's Ark, but without all the animals and without the spiritual or religious aspects. It was simply a man who had received a warning from an unknown race that something bad was going to happen and that he had to build something. So they'd sent him the plans for this device that he was meant to build, but he didn't know the purpose of it, only that if he didn't build it, that something terrible would happen. And at the core of that story is a relationship between him and his daughter. His wife has passed away and he's trying to repair his relationship with his daughter. She thinks that he's going completely insane. So that was the story I had back in 2009, and then in 2012 I met with Shana Bess, and he, we'd been in touch ever since he made Gabriel. And he asked me if I had any science fiction or stories that could be made into a low-budget feature film. And I had Terminus, but it was a much larger scale story. But I could see the potential for it to be scaled down and done in an achievable fashion. And that was how the project was born, eventually becoming, the film that we have today. I wanted to make it because it was high concept. It was concerned with all the themes that I'm really interested in, like redemption and obsession, and family, and people in a state of spiritual crisis. That sort of theme really attracts my attention. And also that it was a very simple story. It was about a very proactive character who'd been given a task and he simply had to build something, and there are other layers to it. In our film, we added the element to the story, that the message was delivered to him in the form of a meteorite that lands, that crash lands to Earth from outer space in the small town that he lives in. David is the character's name. And, he develops a symbiotic relationship with this meteorite, and that's how the message is implanted in him. And how he almost becomes psychotic in a sense, at least to those around him. So that was, the genesis of how the story shaped and how we were able to pull it off. For me, writing's pretty agonizing. Like it's a slow process, and takes, I think 90% of the time is spent just kind of figuring it out before you even put any words to the page. And that just involves a lot of conversation, so I usually work with a co-writer, mainly as a way for me to bounce ideas off somebody. And I think having a co-writer allows me to remain a little bit objective, because you have that relationship with somebody where you're constantly questioning the material and having to justify choices that you make. So 90% of the time is that conversation between you and the co-writer, discussing what the idea is and how it should play out, and then from there I go into a beat sheet sort of stage where we outline a rough paradigm for each sequence. You know, we don't get involved in scenes quite yet, but definitely mapping out an arc, a character arc, and beginning, a middle, and end. And then from there we go to a fleshed out treatment stage, which usually ends up being about a 30-page, 40-page treatment. And that is, you know, nearly a screenplay without the dialogue. It's really kind of charting character arcs, themes, you know, every choice that a character makes. And from that treatment, we refine that 5 or 6 times before we even get to the script stage, because I believe you can waste so much time working on a screenplay unless you've got the story completely nutted out. So we spend a lot of time doing that. I mean, the Coen brothers talk about taking a lot of naps. Instead of naps, we drink a lot of coffee and watch a lot of movies and read a lot. But I think, it may seem like procrastinating, but things are happening during that stage of the writing process. Terminus was a very accelerated process in terms of the screenplay, because I had a treatment for a much more expensive story that then needed to be stripped right down and made turned into a very almost kitchen sink provincial version of what the original story was. So that process, was a page 1 rewrite. Well, we turned in a script. We turned in a version of the expensive version of the script, which had David as a retired scientist. So it had locations in it like a nuclear power plant, and then gradually he became, as the story became more and more downsized, he became a steel worker. And then we couldn't get access to any steel mills. And we'd already basically begun early pre-production. And within a month, we whipped up a draft where David was a mechanic. Whatever he did needed to give him access to a lot of steel, a lot of machinery, things that he could use, and a skill set that he could, put into effect to build this machine, the purpose of which would remain a secret until the end of the film. And basically, I wrote a draft, then Cheyenne wrote a draft first. He's my co-writer. Then I wrote a draft. Then he rewrote my draft. Then I rewrote his draft. And we did that about 4 or 5 times. And then we brought on Gabe Dowrick, my editor on the film, who's also a writer in his own right. And he did a complete rewrite on the script, and added another layer to it, but also simplified it because it was getting quite complex and a little bit heavy on the drama side. So he invigorated the plot, and then I rewrote Gabe's draft, Cheyenne rewrote my draft, and then we went in a circle again, and over about 8 weeks, within 8 weeks we had the finished script. And even that was being refined throughout production, and I don't recommend that. I wouldn't say it was the most ideal process because it was so expedited, but we learned a lot from it, and it was fantastic. And we have a lot of camaraderie between us, and we bounced a lot of ideas with Shane. He had a lot of input, as did the producers, Brett and Tim. So we're collaborators. We work as a bit of a machine. So the headline of the film may say a Marc Furmie film, but it's everybody's film that made it a Marc Furmie film. So if I don't trust the DOP, I'm incredibly nervous, and I've only worked with a very select few DOPs in my time, and the DP I usually worked on, Carl, had been hired by Shane to shoot Infinity, so I needed to work with somebody that I could trust. And Kieran, I'd done a music video with him prior to Terminus, but I was so impressed with the work that he did on that video that I could see what he would be capable of on a much larger scale. And also, I could see that he was young and kind of brave enough to take on such an ambitious project I think an older, more experienced and perhaps more cynical technician would have balked at the idea of doing 25, 30 setups in a day. But Kieran, and he is a perfectionist in his own right, but he took on board the challenge head first. So my working relationship was very, very symbiotic because we needed to be there all the time. Like, we were working throughout pre-production till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, storyboarding nearly every frame in the film. And even though we didn't look at those storyboards once during the actual production, because they were so well ingrained, if you look at the film, it's spot on. Nearly every frame we shot was exact. But it was just the process of him and I sitting together, and I draw, and just laying out what the sequence could be hypothetically. Okay, you've got a wide moving master shot, and then a couple of inserts, and then we need this close up to cap the sequence off. But we needed to design an approach, and him and I did this together, that would allow us to maximize the amount of coverage that we could shoot in a day and tell the story that we needed to tell. So every scene was designed with a moving master shot, which is very Spielbergian. You start with an extreme wide, and you push into a close, and then you pull out to a medium shot, and then you follow a character, and then you over their shoulder. So there's 5 shots happening in one, and then you pick off the little inserts. Okay, his hand's grabbing that. We need to pick that off, or we need to pick up this character's close up. So that was the only way we could make this film, to ensure 2 things: that one, it could only be edited a certain way, which, I heard M. Night Shyamalan talk about that. As much as you either love or hate Shyamalan, this approach that he had to Sixth Sense and Unbreakable is invaluable. He shot very little coverage and did it all in a moving master shot, so that the edit could only be done the way that he intended. So that's the way we designed Terminus, out of necessity. So we weren't shooting manic coverage like I usually do a music video. We were very, very specific and very calculated, and that came through conversations with me and Kieran, and through drawing hundreds of storyboard frames and going out to locations and literally just sitting there and feeling the location and what it was speaking to us, and what we felt the characters would do in that space. And then going to Kieran came to all the rehearsals, the fight rehearsals, the performance rehearsals, to see what these actors would do. And we, even though the shots were incredibly specifically designed, they were designed around what the actors would do. So when we got to set, we'd block them, and we'd give them free rein, and then we'd say, okay, Jai's moving here, let's pull out wide as he does that move, and then we'll push in tight. So yeah, and we used a bungee rig to give us a lot of versatility for a lot of that handheld stuff, and a Steadicam for a lot of stuff. So we didn't lay track very often because I wanted the freedom. So it was either a lock off, or Steadicam stuff, or handheld bungee rig. But occasionally we did do some crane and dolly stuff in the larger sequences. I'm quite relaxed in my approach. I don't like to over-direct on set, but I love to rehearse. And I studied Meisner for 3 years in Sydney, and just as a way for me to understand how to talk to actors. So I've always been comfortable with that, and I've taught a lot of actors in on camera workshops. So I've done that for several years now for a few different schools, and that's given me confidence with directing an actor and being really specific and not giving them result direction. I try to give them playable direction, or workable as ifs, to put them in a place where they can live truthfully. And I think that with Terminus, I spent a lot of time discussing with the actors who their characters were, but also giving them permission to invite things, emotional realities into the circumstance and build their characters so that they could take ownership over them. There was a lot of that. There were a lot of exercises that I got them to do beforehand. So, for instance, Todd Lasance and Vincent Andriano, they both play war veterans, amputees. So I got them to hang out with an amputee, and I also got them to do a little boot camp together, and I got them to spend a lot of time together and just develop that camaraderie. And that relationship really pays off. Same as Jai Coutret, who plays David, and Kendra Appleton, who plays his daughter. They spent a lot of time together in early pre, but then they separated because their characters are estranged at the start of the story. So it was important for me, for them to have that connection and then to break it and almost have an anxiety toward one another as we began production, and then to develop that story through as we shot to take that relationship somewhere. So there's a lot of discussion about who the characters are and building upon the script. We go through the script, we rehearse key scenes. So I'll pick out 3 or 4 different scenes that I think are kind of indicative of who, that display the entire range of who the character might be, and we focus on those scenes. I mean, there's a lot of scenes where characters are just going from A to B. You don't need to rehearse those, but the deeply complex, confrontational, emotional scenes where a character's really unveiling themselves, we rehearsed a lot of those scenes, and that helped. And even though we threw out everything we did in the rehearsal, when we got to the set, we were able to, the actors were able to arrive fresh, but having the confidence that they understood the scene and they understood where their character was coming from. And it was very specific. The locations were our single biggest challenge because the film needed to be small enough and contained, yet because it's set in America, it needed to look very specifically un-Australian. And finding places in New South Wales without gum trees is very difficult. But we sent out a location scout. So initially, we were looking for steel mills, and we couldn't find any steel mills that would give us permission to shoot in. So my whole homage to the Deer Hunter kind of went out the window. So we began looking for mechanics, but we needed to kind of house the majority of the production in a small town somewhere. So this search began for small towns within a reasonable distance that we could base the production in, that we could, and there was a lot of pushback financially against moving the crew out of Sydney, housing them, spending a lot of money. So we looked for locations within Sydney, like Windsor. But even Windsor, outside of a certain mileage, you start to incur a lot of fees, and you don't want crew driving for 2-3 hours a day, to get to and from the shoot, especially when they're tired. So finally, the floodgate opened. We were allowed to look a little further out, and our location manager, Daniel Power, found a small town called Portland, just north of Lithgow, and it's in the middle. It's surrounded by a pine tree plantation, so it looks like, a Northern American Midwest state. It could look like Iowa, and it just had a magical quality to it. And there were things about it that were still very Australian. You had VB signs and stuff like that that we had to kind of cover up, but it was the most uniquely American looking town you could find. So once we found that, a lot of other things began to fall into place. We did try to do kind of the isolated locations as much as we could in Sydney, such as the mechanic that David works at, the hospital that the veterans that they are inpatients in. We found that in Ryde. It was an old abandoned hospital, and that just suited it perfectly. I mean, I don't even think it's still there. I think they've demolished it now, but that was such a find. And we shot in the Australian Technology Park in their old metal workshop. So that is where David builds this machine. And the town of Portland had this old unique cement factory, which we couldn't get inside because of asbestos. but we featured the outside of it, and then we shot the ATP for the interior of it. So there was a lot of kind of putting the puzzle pieces together to make these locations feel like they were in the one place. And I think we did that quite successfully, only because we went through hundreds of locations and discarded so many, and spent hundreds of hours on the road driving and searching. Now the hero house, we did a location recce to a house in Oberon, which is south of Bathurst. And the house wasn't perfect, but driving away from that house, we saw this little cottage that was abandoned, that was owned by the owner of the house, but nobody had lived in there for a long, long time, and it was tiny. And my production designer took a photo of it, and when he got back to Sydney, he, did a bit of Photoshop work to show us what it would look like if it had been clad in American-style timber, because they don't really do the fibro thing over there. I mean, they do in certain places, but it's not as commonplace as having a timber-laden house. So he showed me what it would look like, and it just looked fantastic because the valley that it was in was so majestic and had pine trees. So we weighed up the cost of, it's insane when you think about it, what we attempted for the amount of money we had. But we clad the house, and the art department spent time doing that. And we built the interior of the house in Sydney on a soundstage, in a warehouse in Alexandria that was right under the flight path. So we had to pause every 5 minutes when the actors were delivering dialogue, because there was a jumbo jet over the top of us. But Jamie matched the dimensions of Jamie, our production designer, matched the dimensions of the exterior house and built the interior perfectly. He made it slightly bigger just to get a camera in, but we purposely wanted it to feel a little bit claustrophobic, and it works wonderfully. You can't really tell. Oh, well, the biggest challenge was just time. I mean, we had the people. We had a fantastic crew. We had the best gaffers and grips you could work with amongst the best gaffers and grips you could work with in the business, and certainly on an indie film. So I can't complain about having a shortage of crew. I can only complain about having a shortage of time. But it forces you to be creative. I mean, had I had another 2 weeks, I'm sure I could have, shot things with a little more nuance, but I can't say it would be immeasurably better. I think that pressure, there's a lot to be said for that. And I'm generally, because I've done hundreds of productions before, I'm generally, I'm stressed on set, but I don't show it. Like I internalize it, and I try not to stress, because it will only make things worse. And I'm a big believer in, there's nothing that you can actually control. Everything is out of your control. If an actor decides to throw a tantrum, there's nothing you can do about it, So the biggest challenge was just getting the story told in the time that we had. And I think we only did about 6 or 7 hours of overtime in the 30 days that we shot. And it was just because we had to be really efficient. We had to cull shots from the shot list as we were going. But, you can't do that unless you have a shot list to begin with. Unless you have a vision to begin with, how malleable that vision can be. So it was just, I think people panic when you haven't communicated with them. So Kieran and the first AD were aware of things that could go. That we all knew the story inside and out. We knew what was expendable. The actors knew it, so we were very well prepared in that sense. There's always that last minute kind of rush, and Kieran and I were reshot listing the night before every given day. But we were never, it was actually, I think, compared to most shoots, indie shoots, less chaotic than you would imagine. Yeah. We had a few stressful moments. One was when our set, we were setting up for a scene, and we were involved in a torrential storm in the middle of Portland. And we were flooded out, and we thought the camera van was going to, because basically the ground beneath all the camera vehicles disappeared, turned to mud, and there was just water coming down this hill. So we had to kind of tow the vans out before they toppled over, and that was a terrifying moment. But other than that, and our low loader broke down, so we had a day planned to do a lot of car stuff. And the low loader on its first run took a corner and basically broke its rear wheel off the axle. So we had to do everything sim-trav. And it's those kinds of challenges there. They give you headaches on the day, and in hindsight, everything's rosy. You know, I was cursing the sky when it happened, but you just roll with the punches and you come up with solutions. And I look at the film now, and I can't see anywhere where the low loader would have truly benefited us over and above what we ended up shooting. You know, I don't miss anything that I didn't get. The funding model that we worked under was very unique in that it allowed crew members a stake in the film, and that was, I mean, I'm not privy to the actual figures, but I know that what we achieved for, you know, a very limited amount of money was pretty monumental, because people were working for much less their rate, so that they could have the difference in terms of ownership within the film. Including myself, so we all have a stake in it, and there was a personal investment within the film, and it's actually quite a unique model in that, you know, the crew will be reimbursed their initial investment on first sales, which is pretty much unheard of. So we're in a lucky position that the film will at some stage undoubtedly make its money back, and will make everybody their money back. I believe our Australian sale's been made, but I don't know about the rest of the world. In my personal opinion, looking at the way the market is shifting at the moment, is that video on demand is probably a good way to go. Like a limited theatrical run, simultaneous with a video on demand release. I think, you know, I look at many Australian films that have been released recently that have unfortunately not been given the attention that they deserve, despite being fantastic, because they're being swallowed in the multiplex by larger American films that are impossible to compete with, because, you know, people are going to the movies less often, I think, because of ticket prices, or they're just, our lifestyles are getting busier. So we're spending a lot less money on theatre, you know, on going to the cinema, and we're watching a lot more television, we're watching a lot more iTunes content, and Netflix, you know, which is yet to arrive here. Being able to tell a story that was personal to me, you know, it's a sci-fi story, and it's, you know, it's quite far-fetched in many cases, but the characters, in some ways, all represent aspects of, you know, of things that I can relate to, or people that I can relate to in my life. So I think, yeah, there's a heart in the story, and that's what I enjoy most about it. What I got from the process was working with incredibly talented people, and people that respected the vision and extended themselves far beyond the call of duty, to produce something that, you know, everybody can be proud of. It's a quaint, small story, but it has a very big vision behind it. And I think people will be at the very least impressed. I think the story about the making of it is probably, you know, as interesting, if not more, than the film itself. So there's a really fantastic behind the scenes documentary that Dan Berghofer has put together, which you'll see eventually. Yeah, I am weighing up a few things. I mean, I haven't, you know, it's too early to tell. I mean, I'm still in the process of securing my agent in the US, but I mean, I have a script that I actually thought I would make before Terminus, that Cheyenne and I wrote for Screen Australia. I'm actually retooling that to be set in the United States, only because it's a much more American story. It's more suited to America as a setting, because it's about gun control, and it's about war, and it's about religion, fundamentalist religion, and highly controversial. So it was undoubtedly inappropriate as my first film, because it's very heavy, and I think I would have screwed it up. I'm hoping to shop that around. I've got another sci-fi film that I'm going to pitch when I get to America. But really, you know, I've kind of been exhausted by the process. So I'll probably take the rest of the year off and just focus on shooting commercials, and then I'll hit the ground running early next year and try and, the goal to get the next film up as soon as possible. I think film school, in a loose term, in that, making a feature film could be your film school, making a short film could be your film school, making 12, 15 music videos could be your film school. Yes, an education in film is it's a necessity, but how you achieve it, I don't think it needs to be necessarily academic. I mean, I think there's not enough of a respect for classic films or, the great masterpieces of yesteryear in this current kind of generation. It's underappreciated, but I think the internet really helps, and people can discover things that they weren't able to discover back in the VHS days or early DVD days. I think, the best thing that I think anyone could do is attain really good contacts, attain a really strong network, and that comes through just working in the industry. So if you need to take out garbage bags on set or do unit work, do it, because you get to meet people and it leads to things. And secondly, never to give up. I mean, that's an obvious cliche, but it's so easy. And I've seen people especially since 2008 with the financial crisis, just kind of fall away because it just became too hard. What Australia, makes up for with its lack of opportunity in terms of the sheer number of opportunities, unlike America, we kind of make up for that in just determination. And there's very talented people here. You can find them and they'll work on your projects. Sometimes it's best to ask the biggest person possible and then go down the ladder from there. And you'd be surprised a lot of the times they say yes, because there's this very strong support network here. There's also the tall poppy syndrome of a bit of jealousy and a bit of protectiveness and insecurity in this industry, but that happens everywhere. But generally, most people are incredibly supportive, and I wouldn't be in the position where I was able to make Terminus if it weren't for people like Shayna Bess, if it weren't for mentors that I've had over the years like David Deneen, and other directors, and peers. It's just, I think we're pretty lucky here. But I'd say just don't give up and do as much as possible, whatever it is. I'd go and I'd make a bunch of small pieces that have a shot of getting recognized on Vimeo or YouTube, and then I'd use those to apply for government funding. I mean, I got government funding twice, so I was very lucky for shorts, and I still believe in that as a very viable option for funding. If you can't get that, because it's very difficult, do crowdfunding. Do whatever it takes. My first shorts before I was government funded were all crowdfunded, but what I'd do is I'd hold these fundraising parties and I'd basically put a bar tab on and get everyone pissed and they'd donate money. 90% of the money was from my parents, but it was, I think it's a tough thing to do, but that whatever you need to do to make your vision shine is valid. I mean, I think try and keep the visions small and achievable. My problem, one mistake I kept making when I was growing up was I just have ideas that were way too big for what I could achieve. It's almost better to take a smaller, more contained idea and do it well than to do a big idea really badly. Don't take no for an answer. You got to have the balls, and you got to listen to people's advice, but don't listen to people's criticisms, because they will drag you down. And I think just don't give up. Set your sights on what you want to do, and just do it, and find people that are like-minded, and you'll be unstoppable.